Jeffrey. It's 10:49 p.m., though in a few seconds it'll be 11:49 p.m. Behind me, 2 kids are playing a game of war, and one of them bangs on his tray every time he loses a round. In the row adjacent to ours, an older woman is snoring like an angry boar. The flight attendant still hasn't brought out the drink cart. Unlike you, I can't bring myself to fall asleep, and I'd rather the plane crash into a mountain than sit through Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom again. So now's as good a time as any to do something I should have done before we left. I love you. This you know. After this is all done, I hope you get some understanding of just how much I love you. What I'm about to do fills me with fear and pain, but I do it without hesitation in the hopes that you will get better. I don't know that you will, but we've exhausted every possible option. If there is even the slightest chance that you can be relieved of the incredible agony that you've had to endure for over 2 years, then it is worth any chance and any risk. I've never met someone who had more compassion and more generosity than you. You have given me more than I deserve, without promise of return. I don't know how you found the strength to forgive your brother, but I was literally in awe when you did. I saw you do something that I could never do. Now the hindsight is starting to kick in. I wish I had spent more time at the animal shelter with you. I wish that I had taken you to South Africa, like you'd always talked about. I wish that I'd gotten a chance to see The Lord of the Rings with you. Yes, the extended editions. There is a chance I may still yet do all of those things with you, but I do not trust to hope. I know better. I'm afraid to start off this explanation by revealing that I lied to you, because that will set a poor tone for the rest of this. But I did. We are not going to visit my mother in Arietta, or at least that's not why I wanted to go. She's doing well enough, and barring any unforeseen strangeness, though I'm not sure that I can, she's not about to die anytime soon. I have a different reason for wanting to bring you to my hometown, a reason I hope will bear fruit. There may be a cure to your cancer here, an end to the pain, and the beginning of a new life together. Or there may be more pain in store for both of us. As I said, that's a chance I'm willing to take. I haven't told you much about the town of Arietta, because there isn't much to tell, and that's because there isn't much to the town itself. When you live in a city like Portland, you think of a small town as having about 35,000 people. But when I was young, only about 300 people lived in Arietta, so I think it's safe to say that it really is a small town, by whichever metric you use. Route 10 runs right through the center of town, but apart from that, it is dead set in the absolute middle of nowhere. Whether you head north or south, east or west, you'll soon find yourself surrounded by vast wilderness, in the midst of the Adirondacks. I know that I've mentioned to you that I've had problems with my parents. Their divorce was particularly stressful for me, especially given I was only 12. 12 is an awkward time for many, and for me it meant my first period, the death of my cat, Winston, and an increase in my parents fighting. It was only made worse by the fact that, after fighting, my mother turned her frustrations toward me. She'd shout at me for seemingly no reason, or else command me to do any number of pointless chores. By the time they announced their divorce, I was sick of it all. I hated them with as much disdain as my young heart could feel. So I ran away from home. It was a very childish thing to do, and so very typical of a kid from the 90s, but I just couldn't think of any other way to get back at them, apart from seriously hurting myself, a point which I hadn't quite made it to. It's not as if I was planning on actually making it very far from home, just enough to give them both a good fright. I contemplated whether or not to leave them a letter, but I decided against it. The town was so small that it wouldn't take them long to find me once they'd realized what I'd done, and I wanted to make sure I had made it a good distance. That way they'd have a nice chunk of time to worry. If I was lucky, they might even take some responsibility for it, but I wasn't hopeful. I knew exactly where I wanted to go. Just a few blocks away from my house was Otter Lake. On the eastern side of the lake, there's a trail, the only walking trail out of Arietta. It's not all that well kept because it doesn't get used much at all. If you follow the trail, it leads east for about a half mile or so before you come to a small clearing. There, you'll come to the ruins of what used to be called New Dover, what the people in town now called Old Arietta. Well, ruins might not be the right word for it. That makes it sound more spectacular than it really is. Far from the broken battlements of an Eastern European castle, or the crumbling stones of a Mayan pyramid, the remnants of Old Arietta consist of a few scattered poles sticking straight up out of the ground. The former foundations of small houses made of straw and mud. Other poles lay half buried in the earth, some of them still tied with strands of rope. There are also a few short stone walls made from the rocks collected from the workers digging into the thin soil. Apart from that, there's nothing left. It's a curious little part of the town's history, one that we covered briefly in 3rd grade. Puritan rejects from New Hampshire settled the town in 1689, led by a man named Luke Henry. No one knows why they left their settlement in New Hampshire, or else the reason's never been interesting enough to be worth mentioning. Either way, they planted their flag on the land, which was located in the very edge of a valley at the foot of the Adirondacks. Water collected in the valley and created a festering marshland overgrown with just about every kind of tree you can find in New England. Beech, oak, ash, maple, fir, pine, you name it. I wanted to go there because I was feeling rebellious. I wanted to do something in my oh-so-limited power to strike at them, the same way they struck me every time they fought. People in Arietta don't go to the old village, and they most certainly don't go to the marsh within the valley. If you asked my 3rd grade teacher, she'd tell you that the reason the people of old Arietta left was because of the smell of the swamp, and because the townspeople feared disease. I suppose those things could be true on their own, but that's not why they left. I didn't learn the real reason until I was at a friend's house for her birthday. I was staying the night along with 5 other girls, and her older sister deigned to tell us the real reason why the original settlers left old Arietta. Why the older folks in town, the principal of the high school, the butcher, the deacon at church, don't like to talk about that part of the town's history, and why people don't take the trail that leads east from Otter Lake. It was the sleepwalking. A few days after the town was built, men began to get out of bed and walk in their sleep. They'd be caught by their wives or by a light sleeping neighbor before they could get very far, but all of them were heading in the same direction, toward the valley and the marsh. When the men were woken, each one said they saw the same thing in their dreams. They all saw the twins. The twins, so they said, were a pair of beautiful women who lived deep in the bog, in the very center of the valley, by an ancient oak tree. Both of the twins had the fairest skin they'd ever seen, and drapes of hair as red as autumn leaves, which covered their faces and reached past their waists. They wore no clothes, and sang with sweet voices that hummed and rang like glasses of water played by a human finger. The twins sang to the men while they slept, calling them by name and compelling them to enter the marsh in the dead of night. As would be expected, the Puritan townsfolk feared the worst: witchcraft. They prayed to God, and to Jesus, and to the Holy Ghost, and to whatever else they thought might guard them against black magic. The pastor blessed every building in town, and recited several psalms at the town entrance to ward against dark forces. The townsfolk dreaded to enter the marsh, knowing full well that such a place is dangerous even without the threat of witches. So they put their faith in God to protect them, and their faith was answered with nightmares to all in town. Every man, woman, and child suffered the same terrible dream that night. The twins came to them, but not as a pair of beautiful women. Instead, the twins rampaged through the dreams of the town as a two-headed black mare, each head with a mane of smoke. The head on the left was missing its left eye, and the right eye blazed with furious light like a red ruby held aloft at sunset. On the right head, the condition was reversed. They no longer sang in sweet tones. They shouted and shrieked at the sleeping townspeople, with voices like knives cutting glass. Those that woke could hear sounds coming from the marsh, the anguished calls of many woodland beasts, the howling of wolves, the snarling of catamounts, the roaring of bears, and the tortured cries of creatures which no person could name. The townsfolk knew then that there was nothing they could do against the power of the twins. So they left. They took what they could, left behind what they couldn't, and set off westward, away from the unholy bog and the witches that dwelt within its festering heart. With the town of New Dover abandoned to the mercy of the swamp, Luke Henry and his followers settled a new town, which would become Arietta. I don't suppose you believe the story. I know that I wouldn't if I was in your place. I'm not asking you to believe in anything, not just yet. We are still some time away from the truth of the matter. You may feel hurt or insulted that I've taken so much time to tell what amounts to a ghost story. But before I continue, please know that this is not to diminish your pain. What I am saying, and what I am to do, will sound insane to you, no doubt. All I can tell you is what happened to me. What I saw, what I felt. It may have some bearing on you. And if there is any good in this world left for us, then what I'm about to tell you will provide the framework for your cure. I didn't take much with me when I left home, since I wasn't actually planning on being gone for that long. We were all campers growing up, so I knew what basic supplies to take. A flashlight, some blankets, a pocket knife, some snacks, and a bottle of water, all stuffed into my backpack. I left while my parents were out meeting with their divorce lawyers, making my way toward Otter Lake, then down the path leading east, and to the remains of old Arietta. It looked just as I described it earlier. At the wooden archway marking the entrance to the town, there was a wooden sign with words carved into its surface with a knife. Turn back, for here lie forever the dead and the damned. A chill ran up my spine, no doubt in part because of the brisk autumn air and the dark clouds hanging overhead. They were light gray, and growing darker as the sun behind them moved further to the west. I moved through the center of town, admiring the rotting wooden poles and crumbling stone. It was real, all right, which opened my young mind to the possibilities. What else of what I was told was real? A little ways down the path, leading out of town, I saw the trees looming over me. Enormous firs, bigger than any tree I'd ever seen. Among their lower ranks of needle-covered branches, dense shrubs and ferns grew in thick layers all over the forest floor. Even in the outside, I could hear the sounds of the marsh, the crickets chirping between long intervals of quiet, and the raucous chorus of spring peepers, who were paradoxically singing in the fall. It was already fairly dark standing there, but looking into the woods, I couldn't see past 4 or 5 trees. It was as if the forest was several hours ahead of the rest of the world, and was already close to midnight. I took my flashlight out of my backpack and switched it on, but its feeble beam of light couldn't penetrate very far into the shadow of the forest. Before I took my first step inside, I called to mind some words of advice I had heard at my friend's sleepover.
You will see things in the bog, and you will hear things. They are not real. They are shadows and dreams. They cannot hurt you. But if you heed them, then harm of some sort will befall you.
Those words came from Simon Ainsworth, the only man known to have entered the marsh and returned. With the town of New Dover, soon to be called Old Arietta, abandoned to the mercy of the swamp, Luke Henry and his followers settled a new town, which would become Arietta. For 30 years, their new village flourished. It never grew very big, but its people were healthy, and the horror of the old town was nothing more than an unhappy memory among the oldest residents. That's the way it was for 20 years, until the town was hit with a devastating epidemic of yellow fever. They tried everything they could, from prayer to leeches to Indian remedies, but nothing could stop the spread of the fever. Things became more desperate as time went on, when nearly half of the town had fallen victim. It finally reached a point when Simon Ainsworth came up with a mad solution to the problem. Ainsworth was one of the men who had been visited by the twins in his dreams, and had been coaxed into entering their realm while he slept. The path they had laid out for him was still there in his memory, no matter how hard he had tried to forget it. Knowing the kind of power they wielded, he set off east toward the deserted remnants of old Arietta and the cursed land beyond. No one knows the full story of what Ainsworth saw in that place, but to everyone's surprise, he came back. When he did, he brought with him a small wooden bowl filled with a special elixir. He had all who were sick drink from it once, and by the next day, the fever was all but gone. But though the plague had ended, the people did not celebrate, for Simon Ainsworth said that he had to go back, and this time he wouldn't return. See, he had made a deal with the twins. They gave him the medicine he needed, and in exchange he promised to live with them by the ancient oak tree in the heart of the valley. Perhaps you're beginning to see the method in my madness. But before you take me for mad, let me at least explain why I believe in all of this strongly enough to turn to it for your sake. I didn't feel any immediate difference when I stepped across the threshold of shadow and officially entered the realm of the twins. I guess I half expected the twins to jump out from behind a tree, naked and all. The idea was actually kind of funny. Made me laugh, and how ridiculous it was. But that would be the last time I laughed while in those trees. I had been so absorbed in the mystique of the marsh that I had put my parents out of mind. But for the first several minutes following the path down into the valley, that sense of titillation began to wear off. And I wondered if they had gotten home yet. Was it just then dawning on them that they had driven away their only daughter, and that she was now wandering the wilderness all alone at nightfall. It gave me a kind of bitter joy to think of them panicking at my disappearance. I tried to imagine how mortified they might be if they realized where I'd gone. I snapped out of my thoughts and back to where I was when I stepped down into a tepid pool of frigid water. I aimed my flashlight downwards to get a better look at the spot where I had put my foot. The surface was coated in a film of green algae. When I pulled out my foot, my sneaker was covered in brown sludge. The shock was so great that my teeth began to chatter. Waving my flashlight around, I tried to see if there was another, drier way forward, but to no avail. I hadn't simply stepped into a standalone puddle. This was the marsh. I took another step, and my other foot met the icy waters of the swamp, going up past my ankles. When I took a third step, I saw something leap away from my foot and into the muddy water. I didn't get a good look at it, but based on the size, the creature in question had to be a bullfrog. I thought that was strange. Usually the frogs had all gone to sleep for the winter by this point, and I'd have thought it true here given how cold the water was. But then I remembered more words from Simon Ainsworth.
The twins see and hear all that goes on in the marsh. The frogs and toads are their eyes and ears. And if you see a fat old bullfrog squalling in the mire, staring at you with those side-face eyes of his, well, that's twins getting a good look at you.
I scanned the area with my flashlight, looking for any frogs that might be looking my way. I couldn't find any, and couldn't help but feel somewhat foolish. But my fears weren't entirely dissipated. There were still the hundreds of spring peepers calling from every corner of the marsh. And it wasn't very difficult at all to think that at least one of them might be watching me from some dark hole in the ground, or in a tree trunk. I was a good ways into the land of the twins at this point, and given the cold swamp water and the growing darkness, it would have made perfect sense to head back. It had been at least a couple hours, and I'm sure my parents must have been sufficiently spooked by then. Anyone in their right mind would have done just that, but... well, frankly, I don't think I was in my right mind. The memory is somewhat fuzzy, but I remember a very unusual thing. A feeling. It was like a kind of gleeful curiosity, almost like what a child feels while staring at colorfully wrapped presents under the Christmas tree. The shining, brilliantly patterned wrapping paper invites young onlookers to rip into it like a hungry coyote into a dead rabbit. The marsh had a similar effect on me, though I'm still not sure why. Every time I thought about heading back, it was as if a voice, quiet, distant, but nevertheless present, whispered to me, "No, not yet. Just a few more steps. You might see something amazing." And after I took those few more steps, the voice spoke again. "No, not much farther, just a little more, just up to that birch tree." All the while, night sank ever further onto the already blackened wilderness, bathing the forest in shadow. My flashlight, which had seemed puny and hapless when I first turned it on, now looked positively pathetic, like its useless attempts to penetrate the dark was an insult to the marsh. And as I felt the dark closing in, another huge bullfrog leaped from a small rock sitting in the water as I stepped beside it. I was startled and let go of the flashlight's handle. It fell clumsily into a puddle, its insides filling with dirty water. It flickered a few times, and then went out entirely. That's when I felt the shift, from an eerie sense of unease to full-fledged terror. I could see nothing at first, and stood still in the mud as I waited for my eyes to adjust. It was a surprisingly quick process, as if everything around me took on a pale blue tint. Beneath the layers of crisscrossing branches, there was neither starlight nor moonlight. I looked behind me and saw nothing but more marshland, with no recognizable path back to where I'd come from. Only then did I realize the full extent of the situation which I had so stupidly created for myself. I was lost, alone, in the dark, in the middle of the wild. I heard something that made me hold my breath. At first I thought it was a loon, with its haunting, mournful cry like something between a howl and a whine. But it kept rising up from somewhere far beyond the trees, and turned inexplicably into a horrendous, otherworldly, maniacal chortle. It was like the strangeness of something profoundly inhuman, attempting to mimic something as fundamentally human as laughter. I can't know for sure, but it felt like there was more than one, and they called to each other from the disparate corners of the marsh. Those terrible cackles rang from miles to the north, then the south, and then they came from the west, but they were no longer miles away. Now it sounded like they were hiding behind a nearby grove of trees not 200 feet from me. I spun around and caught my foot on something sticking out of the mire. I fell face first into a pile of something rank, like a compost heap. When I pulled my dirty face out of it, I heard the sound again, even closer this time, just to the left. And then I clapped my hands over my ears as it screeched just inches away from my face. I gritted my teeth and shut my eyes, waiting for it to end. When I no longer heard the muffled sounds seeping between my fingers, I slowly released my ears and opened my eyes. Those sounds were so loud, so horrible, that the monotonous background of peepers and crickets sounded like silence in comparison. There was nothing there but the marsh and me. Until I heard another sound, a very different sound. From just behind the trees in front of me, I heard something like the rush of a great wind, exploding upwards into the sky, and the flapping of uncountable numbers of wings. It was as if 100 million birds had all taken off instantly, and no, that is not an exaggerated number, that is precisely how many it felt like. I covered my head, as if the unseen swarm was about to swoop over me at any second. But it never did. It just kept rising upwards through the trees, until it was gone. Then it truly was silent. Even the frogs and the insects had ceased their calls. I don't know if I had ever experienced such a powerful silence before, or ever since. Even that indefinable ring that you can find in your ears when sitting still in a noiseless room was gone. Despite how awful the sounds I had heard were, this was somehow worse, as if the entire universe was now holding its breath in anticipation of something unthinkably terrifying. And just like that, the absolute worst possible sound that could have echoed through those trees. I was not expecting it at any point up until then, but when I did hear it, my heart filled with dread. I was colder than the water. My hands and feet were half submerged within the thick, oozing mud, and as I attempted to pull them out and get to my feet, I floundered miserably, like a panicked salamander. All the while, the sound grew louder. Unlike the others, it didn't come from all around. It was coming from directly in front of me, and moving along a steady course that was bringing it closer and closer with each passing second. It was the furious, relentless pounding of hooves against the waterlogged earth. When I was finally able to get myself on my hands and knees, still fighting against the mud crawling up my extremities, I looked out in front of me. My chest was heaving up and down, each frantic breath exhaling a petrified cloud of hot mist. Through a pair of diverging trees about 50 feet ahead, there was a patch of pure black, untouched by the blue hue of the rest of the surrounding marsh. The galloping hooves were coming from there. As I kneeled, totally frozen in place, I stared at that black spot. I have never seen darkness like that before. As if it was a shade too dark for human eyes to register. But it didn't stay that way for too much longer. As the hooves grew even louder, something began to appear through the blackness. 2 small specks of pale red light, which grew brighter and more vivid as they came even closer. I knew there was no chance I'd be able to escape what was coming. Even if I wasn't half submerged in quicksand, I'd never be able to outrun it. To outrun them. Like the defenseless child I was, I flung myself backward into the mud, tucking my face against my chest and covering my head with my arms. I sobbed, though the sound was drowned out by the charging creature approaching, and hot tears wound their way down my cheeks. There was no time for regret. I was wholly consumed by the fact that this was the end. I was going to die. I heard an obscene scream. It cut my ears like broken glass, and felt the displacement of air as something large leaped over me. I could even somehow feel the shadow of the thing pass over my face. Then the shifting air swirled around me and rose up into the ceiling of winding limbs and branches. Wind rushed through the dried leaves still clinging to their diminishing hosts. The desiccated flesh of the leaves scratched against each other, creating a prominent rustling which rang through the forest. In the throes of terrified imagination, I could swear I heard the leaves whispering underneath the dry rustle. In terms of seconds and minutes, I don't know how long it took for me to uncurl from my fetal position and realize that I was alone again, and that the vociferous peepers and crickets had returned. I looked around me and saw no sign of the creature I knew had been coming. Indeed, there was no sign that any of the strange things I had seen, heard, or felt had happened. The grip of the mud against my legs slacked, and I was able to scramble pitifully to my feet, the clothes soaked with brown water and caked in clumps of dripping sludge. I saw something over the corner of my eye which caused me to yelp like a frightened dog and leap nearly 5 feet in the air. The something in question was my flashlight, which flickered to life and shone on a patch of ground behind me. In the beam of pale white light, I saw a trail of footprints leading backwards away from where I stood. I was so filled with relief, I didn't care that they were most definitely not there the last time I looked. I backtracked through the marsh as quickly as I could, and made it to the path that led through the woods and out of the valley. In a sort of mindless stupor, I wandered through Old Arietta and back down the trail to Otter Lake. My legs carried me half-consciously toward home, as if there was any other place I could go to. Before I made it, a pair of brilliant white headlights filled my field of vision. I shielded my face against the sudden flood of bright light, as my eyes were still accustomed to the night. When I could finally see again, I realized that my mom had seized my hand and was pulling me toward the car while berating me for just about every reason she could find. It never occurred to them that I had tried to run away. no doubt in part because they found me on my way home. They had no idea I had gone, and in that moment, I couldn't remember myself. I was just content to be away from that place. That's the story of what happened to me. I know that it's too much to ask that you believe me, especially given that I've already admitted to lying to you about one matter. I can't make you believe. All I can do is tell you what happened to me. The rest is up to you. But if you can at least give me this much credit, that even if I'm wrong, I am not disingenuous. These things happened. Whether or not they are the work of a pair of evil witches, I saw things and heard things and felt things that I have never been able to explain otherwise. If you can give me that much, then here is your hope. 2 others have tried to enter the marsh and seek the aid of the twins over the last few hundred years. Neither of them ever returned. I don't know why the twins granted Simon Ainsworth's request. Maybe it was because he was unselfish. One of the others that went to the twins was a man who had been spurned by the woman he wanted to marry. He was hoping the twins would bewitch her. The other man wanted to buy back his property after it had been seized by the bank. I don't think it's a stretch to believe that because the other 2 had selfish desires, they had been rejected. If this is the case, then maybe the twins will take pity on us. Maybe they have the power to rid you of this particularly rare, virulent, painful form of cancer. Given the fact that we have reached the absolute end of our rope, isn't it worth at least trying? I know it is, but not because I trust the twins. Simon Ainsworth warned against that much.
Should you make it to the oak, to where the twins make their home, do not trust to their goodwill. They have none. They are jealous and fickle, and their plans are not a man's plans.
I have my own reasons for believing that the twins will cure you. Over the last several weeks, I've been having strange, frightening dreams. Sometimes they're just like my normal dreams, except for a few odd details. When the dream plays out, I can hear a heart beating in the background, or see the lights shining from somewhere far off. Others are much more literal. I find myself back in the marsh, hearing and seeing the same things I saw then. The most recent ones have gone a step further. I'm in the marsh, but I'm not alone. I'm with a man, though he's hidden in shadow, and I can't see his face. But his voice seems familiar somehow, as if I had heard it ages ago and then forgotten. He speaks to me.
You are ready,
he says. Ready for what? I ask.
They saw you,
he says.
but you were not ready, so they touched you.
I didn't need to ask who. What does that mean?
They can see you and reach out to you, no matter how far you go.
What do they want?
You,
Why?
their plans are not a man's plans.
That's when I knew. This was Simon Ainsworth. There is some part of him, whether it's a ghost, a visage, whatever, that is still trapped in the marsh, under the ownership of the twins. He had been sent to relay this message to me. He continued.
They will take it, but you must return now that you are ready.
What do I have to do?
Come to the marsh, to the oak. They are waiting.
What if I refuse?
Your husband's pain will know no end, and no limit.
Every night, he comes to me. I ask him the same questions, and he gives me the same answers. There's no doubt in my mind what is to happen next. As I type these words, we are on our way to Arietta. We'll check in with my mother, and then I must go. I have no reason to think that I will return, not if Ainsworth's any guide. I can only expect that my fate will be something like his, and that is not a comforting thought. Just thinking about it makes me feel like I've swallowed a pound of manure filled with maggots and worms. But I can't stand to see you in pain anymore. I will trade my freedom for yours, if not gladly, then resolutely. Every moment I see you fighting the torture, it's like feeling my own strength wither away. As far as I can tell, there are only two paths left to us. One leads only to more suffering for both of us. Both its course and its destination are certain. But there is another path. A darker one. I will assuredly never return from it. But it may lead to your salvation. Either way, there is no happy ending for me. But you have a chance, however slim. I am willing to take it. And once you find this note, I can only pray that you'll forgive me for all of this. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I've met whatever fate the twins have in store for me. Hopefully this means your cancer will soon be gone, if I dared presume that it was gone already. Goodbye, Geoffrey. My love for you is too great to be beaten back by the fear of the unknown and the undreamed. And if you simply concluded that I am completely and utterly insane, I can't begrudge you that. But at least know that whatever delusions I may suffer, my love for you is stronger than them. I want you to be happy, and to live the life you've always wanted. Share it with whoever makes you happiest. Forever yours, Cecilia Brown.